The year is 1962. Somewhere in the Soviet Union, in the industrial city of Kazan, in a cramped one-room apartment on an unremarkable street that smells of damp concrete and boiled cabbage, a man dies alone. No honor guard, no state funeral, no flowers from the Politburo, no obituary in Pravda, no general's uniform laid out on a chair by the door, just silence. The neighbors who found him did not immediately understand who he was. Why would they? He was registered under a different name. He had no rank. He had no privileges. He was, on paper, nobody. A middle-aged man with a ruined liver and a past he was forbidden to speak about. His body lay there the way bodies lie in apartments across the Soviet Empire every single day, unremarkably, without ceremony, without consequence. His name was Vasily Yosifovich Stalin, son of the man who had ruled 1/6 of the Earth's surface with an iron fist for nearly 3 decades. Son of the man whose portrait hung in every classroom, every factory, every train station from Brest to Vladivostok. Son of the man before whom generals trembled, before whom foreign diplomats rehearsed their sentences in mirrors, before whom even the most hardened commissars chose their words with surgical care. That man's son died at 40 years old, 2 days shy of his 41st birthday, in a city of exile with no one beside him, stripped of his name, his rank, his past, and his future. His sister Svetlana, who would one day defect to the West and write about her family in terms that shocked the world, said of her brother simply, his life was tragic. 3 words. A life compressed into 3 words. But those 3 words contain an entire universe of questions. How does a boy born at the very center of power end up dying at its farthest margin? How does a general become a ghost? How does a name that once opened every door in the Soviet Union become a name that is quietly, deliberately erased? This is not a story about a man who squandered his advantages. That narrative, the easy one, the comfortable one, suggests agency. It suggests choice. It suggests that somewhere along the way, Vasily Stalin had options laid out before him like cards on a table, and he simply picked the wrong ones. This investigation tells a different story. This is the story of what the Soviet system did to Vasily Stalin, how it built him into something it could use, then broke him into something it could discard, and finally erased him when his very existence became an inconvenience to the new order of things. It is a story about the machinery of power, about what it means to be born inside that machinery, and about what happens to a human being who is never once treated as a human being, but always, only, as a symbol. To understand the ending, you have to go back to the beginning. The world he was born into March 21st, 1921. Vasily Yosifovich Jugashvili, he would not officially take the name Stalin until much later, enters the world in Moscow, into a household that is, by any measure, extraordinary. His father, Yosif Vissarionovich Stalin, is not yet the all-powerful general secretary. That title comes in April of 1922, but he's already a man of enormous influence within the Bolshevik Party. A man who has survived the revolution, the Civil War, years of underground organizing, czarist prisons, and Siberian exile. He's a man forged in the coldest possible furnace, a man who has learned to trust no one and to treat sentiment as a weakness that gets people killed. His mother, Nadezhda Alleluyeva, is 20 years old when Vasily's born. She's educated, politically engaged, idealistic, a true believer in the revolutionary project in a way that her husband, for all his rhetoric, never quite was. She's also deeply unhappy. The apartment is full of staff, of party comrades coming and going, of the constant hum of a household that exists not as a private sanctuary, but as an extension of political life. There are nannies, guards, attendants. There is always someone present, and yet the specific warmth of parental attention of a father and mother who look at their child and see simply their child is almost entirely absent. When Vasily is born, Stalin is reportedly disappointed. He had wanted a daughter. According to accounts from those who were present in those early years, he barely spoke to Nadezhda for a month after the birth. not out of cruelty necessarily, or not only out of cruelty, but out of that particular Stalinist manner of expressing displeasure, cold withdrawal, the silent treatment weaponized to maximum effect. Vasily would spend much of his life trying to break through exactly that wall. A childhood without a center. The person who raised Vasily Stalin was not his mother and was not his father. His mother, Nadezhda, was consumed by her own internal crisis, her complicated marriage, her political studies, her growing disillusionment. She was not indifferent to her children in a monstrous way, but she was simply not present in the way that children need. The domestic details of child care bored her. The nanny ran the household. His father was, in any practical sense, absent. Stalin's working days were impossibly long, his attention entirely monopolized by the construction of Soviet power. When he did appear in the family home, his presence was more like a weather event than a paternal visit. The atmosphere changed, everyone adjusted their behavior, and then he was gone again. Into this vacuum stepped a man named Karl Pauker. Pauker was a senior NKVD officer, head of the operational department of the secret police, and he served as one of Stalin's personal bodyguards. He was an unusual figure, Hungarian-born, theatrical in personality, with a gift for mimicry that Stalin found genuinely amusing in the rare moments when the dictator allowed himself to be amused. He became a fixture in the household, a familiar face, a man who took the time to actually talk to the children. For young Vasily, Pauker was the closest thing to a father figure he had. Think about what that means. The most stable adult male presence in the life of Stalin's son was a secret policeman, a man whose entire professional existence was organized around surveillance, control, and the mechanics of state terror. A man who, by the nature of his work, treated loyalty as a transaction and relationships as instruments of utility. Whatever lessons about human connection Vasily absorbed in those early years, he absorbed them from the architecture of that world. And then, in 1937, Pauker was arrested. Vasily was 16 years old. He did not know why it happened. How could he? The Great Terror did not explain itself. People simply disappeared. One day, Pauker was there. The next day, he was not. And within months, he was dead, shot on Stalin's personal order, his name becoming one of the thousands of names that would be quietly excised from photographs, from documents, from memory. The man Vasily had relied on most in the world vanished without explanation, and there was no one in that household equipped to explain grief or loss or the particular horror of watching someone you care about be swallowed by the system your father runs. November 1932. But before Pauker's arrest, there was another loss, one that would leave a deeper and more permanent wound. On the night of the 8th of November, 1932, Nadezhda Alliluyeva attended a banquet at the Kremlin marking the 15th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. Something happened at that banquet. Historians debate the precise details, but the marriage had been deteriorating for years, and that night, something broke. She came home. Sometime during the night or early morning of the 9th of November, she died. The official Soviet announcement said, heart failure. Later, when the story could no longer be completely contained, it was described as peritonitis, an internal inflammation. For decades, that was the official version. The truth, which Svetlana and others eventually confirmed, is that Nadezhda Alliluyeva shot herself. She was 31 years old. Vasily was 11. Stalin's response to his wife's death was, in its way, entirely consistent with his character. He did not speak publicly about what had happened. He retreated into a cold fury. He reportedly said, standing over her open coffin, "She left me as an enemy," a statement so revealing of his psychology that it almost defies analysis. Even in the face of his wife's suicide, his first instinct was to frame her death as an act of political betrayal directed at him. In the weeks that followed, Stalin's surviving emotional energy, whatever there was of it, turned almost entirely toward Svetlana, his daughter. She was 6 years old, she looked like her mother, and she became the object of a fierce, possessive, complicated affection, that Stalin was incapable of distributing any more evenly than he distributed anything else. Vasily at 11 was left on the outside of that attention. The first drink. The details of exactly when Vasily Stalin first began drinking are difficult to pin down with the precision of a court document. What the historical record does confirm, through the accounts of tutors, household staff, and later party officials, is that he was drinking seriously by the age of 13. 13 years old. In a different family, in a different world, 13-year-old Vasily would have been surrounded by adults asking hard questions. What is this boy running from? What is this boy not being given that he's trying to find at the bottom of a glass? What pain is so large and so unaddressed that a child reaches for numbness before he has even finished growing? In the Stalin household, no one asked those questions. The nannies were afraid to report too much to the father. The party officials who cycled through the household were afraid of everything. The father himself was busy building a totalitarian state and managing the terror that kept it running. And so Vasily drank, and no one intervened in any meaningful way, and the years passed, and the boy who had never been properly seen or properly held or properly taught how to be a person grew into a young man carrying an invisible wound that would shape every decision he ever made. The Soviet system had not yet formally touched him. He was still, on paper, a boy, a general's son, a child of privilege, but the damage was already done, not by his own choices, not yet, but by the specific shape of the world he had been born into. A world where power replaced love, where proximity to greatness substituted for genuine care, where the most important man alive had no idea, or perhaps no interest in knowing, what was happening inside the boy who carried his name. What we are really investigating. When historians write about Vasily Stalin, they most often write about his failures, the drunken binges, the military incompetence, the abuse of his position, the scandals. And those things are real. This investigation will not pretend otherwise. The evidence is documented. The pattern is undeniable. But failure does not emerge from a vacuum. A child who is not taught to be a person does not simply choose one morning to become a disaster. A boy who loses his mother at 11, who watches his father's substitute father be taken away and shot at 16, who grows up in a household where no one ever simply sits with him and asks how he's doing. That boy is not making free choices in any meaningful sense of the word. He's surviving in the only ways he knows how. The Soviet system created Vasily Stalin. It gave him his rank before he earned it. It gave him his medals before he deserved them. It surrounded him with people who flattered him because they feared his father. And it removed from his life every honest voice that might have reached him. It made him into a particular kind of man, one who had been taught that consequences did not apply to him. And then, when it was no longer convenient to maintain that fiction, it destroyed him. That is the story we're here to investigate. A boy born at the summit of power, a life spent in free fall, a death in a one-room apartment 2 days before his 41st birthday with no one there to hold his hand. His sister said his life was tragic. She was right. But tragedy, properly understood, is never simply about what a person does. It is about the forces that shaped what they became. And the force that shaped Vasily Stalin most completely, more than his own choices, more than his flaws, more than his worst moments, was the system that bore his father's name. There is a particular kind of loneliness that no outsider can fully see. It is not the loneliness of poverty where the absence is visible. No food on the table, no coat in winter, no shoes that fit. It is a different kind of absence entirely. It is the loneliness of a child who lives in a house full of people and is surrounded by every material comfort the state can provide, and yet wakes up every morning to the specific, bone-deep knowledge that no one in that house is truly paying attention to him. Not attention in the political sense, not attention in the administrative sense, but attention in the only sense that matters to a child, the simple, unhurried, unconditional awareness of a parent who looks at their son and thinks, "You, I see you. You matter to me not because of what you represent, not because of whose name you carry, but because you are you. Vasily Stalin never received that attention, and that absence, quiet and visible, never spoken about in any official document, is the key that unlocks everything that followed. The father who was not there to understand Vasily's childhood, you first have to understand the man at the center of it, or rather, the man who was conspicuously absent from its center. Joseph Stalin in the 1920s and early 1930s was a man in the process of becoming something the world had rarely seen. He was building power on a scale that required total, relentless focus. The inter-party struggles, the collectivization campaigns, the first 5-year plan, the constant navigation of alliances and betrayals within the Bolshevik leadership. All of it demanded everything he had. There was no remainder left over for fatherhood, but it would be too simple and too generous to explain Stalin's absence from his son's life as merely a function of busyness. The historical record, assembled from memoirs, interviews, and the accounts of people who lived and worked in close proximity to the Stalin household, suggests something more fundamental. Stalin did not know how to be a father. More precisely, he did not believe that being a father required anything particular of him. Children, in his worldview, were not individuals with interior lives that needed tending. They were extensions of the family line, future instruments of the state, small people who would eventually become useful or not. The emotional labor of parenting, the sitting with a child in the dark when they are frightened, the patient repetition of lessons, the willingness to be bored alongside someone you love, was simply not part of his conception of what a man owed his children. He expressed affection in gestures and in moments, never in sustained presence. He could be playful when it suited him, demonstrating a rough and unpredictable warmth that those around him found both touching and bewildering precisely because it was so rare. But those moments were weather events, sudden, brief, followed by long stretches of cold indifference. For Vasily, those moments of warmth became everything. He would spend the rest of his life chasing them. The mother who was leaving, Nadezhda Alliluyeva, is one of the most tragic figures in a story full of tragic figures. She married Stalin when she was 16 years old and he was nearly 40. The marriage was, from the beginning, structured around an enormous imbalance of age, of experience, of power, of personality. Stalin was already a hardened revolutionary, a man who had survived things that most people cannot imagine. Nadezhda was a girl who believed passionately in the revolution and who was, perhaps, not fully equipped to understand what she was stepping into. By the late 1920s, the marriage was visibly deteriorating. Nadezhda was intelligent, politically aware, and increasingly disturbed by what she was witnessing, both in her household and in the Soviet Union more broadly. She was studying at the Industrial Academy in Moscow, surrounded by students who were not afraid to talk honestly about the human cost of collectivization, about the villages emptied and the families destroyed in the name of socialist construction. What she was hearing at school was not what she was hearing at home. She was also, by multiple accounts, deeply unhappy in her personal life. Stalin's coldness, his infidelities, his volcanic temper, his complete unwillingness to treat her as an equal or even as a full human being with her own perspective. All of it accumulated over the years into something that pressed on her constantly. She suffered from severe headaches. She had periods of profound depression. She was a young woman in an impossible position, tethered to a man she had perhaps once loved and was now frightened of, living inside a political structure that left her no options and no exits. And through all of this, Vasily was watching. Children are extraordinarily perceptive instruments. They register the emotional temperature of a household with a precision that adults often underestimate. They cannot always name what they are seeing, cannot always articulate the tension they feel, but they feel it. In the quality of silence at the dinner table, in the way adults look at each other or deliberately do not look at each other, in the particular atmosphere of a house where something is wrong that no one will explain. Vasily grew up inside that atmosphere. His mother was present in the physical sense. She was in the apartment, she was at meals, she was nearby, but she was elsewhere in every way that mattered. Her attention was turned inward toward her own crisis, toward the weight she was carrying that would eventually become too heavy. What Vasily received from his mother was not so much neglect as absence. She was not cruel to him. She was simply not there in the way he needed her to be. The nanny ran the household. The nanny managed the children's days, their meals, their schedules, their needs. Nadezhda was a presence in the background, real but unreachable. Karl Pauker, the substitute. And so into that gap stepped Karl Pauker. It is worth pausing on this figure because he is crucial to understanding Vasily, and because the story of his relationship with the boy is one of the most quietly devastating threads in this entire narrative. Pauker was born in Budapest in 1893. Before the revolution, he had worked as a hairdresser and as a theater stagehand, professions that gave him a theatrical sensibility and a talent for reading rooms and pleasing difficult audiences. He came to Russia after the revolution, joined the Bolshevik cause, and rose steadily through the ranks of what would become the NKVD. By the late 1920s, he was one of Stalin's most trusted personal guards, not merely a bodyguard in the physical sense, but a member of the inner circle who spent genuine time with the Stalin family. He was funny. He could do impressions. He made Stalin laugh in ways that very few people could, and he took the time. Genuinely took the time to engage with Vasily. What did that engagement look like? We do not have detailed records of their conversations, their walks, their moments together, but we know from the accounts of household staff and family members that Pauker was a fixture in Vasily's early life. A familiar, stable, warm presence in a household that had precious little warmth to offer. For a boy starved of male attention, of the specific kind of guidance and interest that a father is supposed to provide, Pauker filled a space that should never have been empty in the first place. He was not Vasily's father. He was a secret policeman whose entire career was built on the architecture of the Soviet terror state. But he was present. He was consistent. He noticed the boy, and then, in 1937, he was gone. Stalin signed the order himself. Pauker was arrested in April of that year, accused of being a foreign spy, the charge that the terror used as a universal solvent to dissolve anyone who had become inconvenient. He was shot in August, 3 months after his arrest, at the age of 43. Vasily was 16 years old. No one sat with him and explained what had happened. No one offered comfort or context. The man who had been the most consistent, caring presence in his young life simply ceased to exist, and the machinery of the Soviet state rolled forward without pause. And the boy was left to absorb that disappearance in silence the way everyone in the Soviet Union absorbed every disappearance, by not speaking of it, by pretending it had not happened, by continuing on. What does that do to a person? What does it teach a 16-year-old about attachment, about trust, about the permanence of the people you rely on? It teaches him that no one is permanent, that caring about someone is a vulnerability, that the people who are close to power, the people who are close to his father, can be removed without warning, without reason, without recourse. It teaches him that love is not a safe place to build a life. November 9th, the night everything changed. But the defining wound came 5 years earlier when Vasily was 11. The night of the 8th of November, 1932, was a night of celebration for the Soviet elite. A grand banquet at the Kremlin marking 15 years since the Bolshevik Revolution. The room was full of the most powerful people in the Soviet state. Generals, commissars, party secretaries, their wives and companions, all dressed in their best, all performing the rituals of solidarity and triumph that the Soviet system required. Nadezhda was there. Stalin was there. Something happened between them. The exact nature of the incident has been reconstructed differently by different witnesses, but the underlying reality was not in dispute. The marriage had reached a point of no return. The tension that had been building for years came to a head that night, in some form that left Nadezhda walking home alone through the Moscow streets. What happened in the apartment after that is something history cannot fully reconstruct. The household staff heard nothing unusual. The morning of the 9th, Nadezhda Alliluyeva was found dead. The announcement that went out to the Soviet public said she had died of heart failure. She was 31 years old, and heart failure in a woman of 31 required a certain suspension of disbelief. But in the Soviet Union of 1932, people had already learned not to ask inconvenient questions. Later accounts, from Svetlana, from other family members, from people who were in proximity to the household in those days, established what had actually happened. Nadezhda had taken her own life. Vasily was 11 years old when they told him his mother was dead. Whether they told him the truth about how she died is unclear. What is clear is that he was 11 and she was gone, and the household that had already been cold became, overnight, something closer to ice. Stalin's grief expressed itself as fury and withdrawal. He reportedly refused to attend the funeral. He walked away from the open coffin before the ceremony concluded, leaving others to finish what he could not. His emotional world, already constricted to a narrow band of acceptable feelings, simply shut down around this event. He did not speak of Nadezhda in any personal way to anyone for the rest of his life, and he turned with an intensity that had nowhere else to go toward Svetlana. Svetlana was 6 years old, and she looked like her mother, and something about that combination of resemblance and helplessness unlocked in Stalin a fierce, consuming tenderness that he had never found a way to give to Vasily. He called her by affectionate nicknames. He wrote her letters. He involved himself in her life in ways that were excessive, even suffocating. But they were unmistakably the gestures of a father who felt something. Vasily watched this from the outside. The boy left behind. There is no crueler education in childhood than the education of comparison. Not the explicit comparison, not a parent who says openly, "I prefer your sister," but the implicit comparison that lives in a household's daily geometry, whose drawings go up on the wall, who gets summoned when the father is in a good mood, whose accomplishments are noted and whose are passed over, who is held and who is not. Vasily received his education in comparison every day of his adolescence. He was not ignored in the administrative sense. He was fed, he was clothed, he was educated by tutors, and then sent to school. His material needs were met with the full resources of the Soviet state. But in the currency that actually matters to a developing child, attention, interest, the sustained sense of being seen and valued by the people who are supposed to love you above all others, he was bankrupt. His tutors reported that he was not unintelligent. He had energy and curiosity and a stubborn streak that might, in different circumstances, have been channeled into something productive, but he had no discipline because no one had ever taught him discipline in a way that he could absorb. He had no patience because patience is something you learn from people who are patient with you. He had no capacity for managing frustration because frustration had always been answered, not with guidance, but with either indulgence or indifference. He began drinking at 13. That sentence is worth sitting with, not reading past, sitting with. A 13-year-old boy in any context who begins drinking seriously is a 13-year-old boy who is in pain. That is the only explanation. Children do not seek numbness recreationally. They seek it because something inside them needs numbing, because the waking state has become too difficult to bear without some form of relief. What was Vasily numbing? The motherless apartment, the father who looked through him to get to Svetlana, the vanishing of every stable figure in his life, the specific agony of being the son of the most powerful man in the world, which sounds like privilege from the outside and feels from the inside like being a planet orbiting a star so bright it burns everything in its vicinity. You cannot live in sunlight that intense. You can only find ways to survive it. What the system made by the time Vasily Stalin was sent at 17 to the Kachin flying school, which we will examine in the next part of this investigation. He was already a particular kind of person, not a villain, not a hero, something more complicated and more sad. A boy who had been shaped by forces entirely outside his control into someone who had never learned how to be ordinary. He had never been held accountable in any consistent way because accountability requires someone who cares enough to follow through, and no one in his life had ever cared enough in that specific way. He had never been allowed to fail and recover because his failures were either covered up or ignored. He had never been permitted the ordinary childhood experiences of consequence and correction that teach a person slowly, clumsily, but effectively how to become someone who can function in the world. He had been given instead a name, a famous name. A name that opened doors before he reached them and cleared rooms before he entered them, and made every person around him into either a flatterer or a man pretending not to be afraid. A name is not a childhood. A name is not a father. A name is not a mother or a mentor or an honest voice that tells you the truth about yourself when you need to hear it most. Vasily Stalin had one of the most famous names in the world, and he had none of the rest of it. He was 17 years old, and the machine that had already taken so much from him was about to take the next thing, his chance at an honest life. It would dress him in a uniform he had not earned, put him in a cockpit he was not ready for, surround him with men who would tell him what he wanted to hear, and call all of it a military career. The wreckage, as we shall see, was inevitable. There is a particular fraud that totalitarian systems commit with extraordinary efficiency. It is not the fraud of the forged document or the falsified report or the rewritten history, though the Soviet system was accomplished at all of those things. It is a subtler fraud, one that operates in plain sight, one that everyone around it can see and no one is permitted to name. It is the fraud of the manufactured man, the systematic construction of a person's reputation, rank, and identity from materials that were never truly his. Medals he did not earn, promotions he did not deserve, achievements recorded in files that bore only a passing relationship to what had actually happened. The Soviet system performed this fraud on many people. It performed it on Vasily Stalin with a thoroughness that bordered on the artistic. And the tragedy, the part that makes this not simply a story of corruption, but a genuinely human story, is that somewhere inside the manufactured general, there was a real young man who might have wanted to prove himself honestly. Who might, given genuine standards and genuine consequences, have found a way to build something real. We will never know because the system never gave him the chance. It gave him something much worse than failure. It gave him false success. Kachin, the school that lied. In 1938, Vasily Stalin was 17 years old and not, by any honest assessment, a promising candidate for advanced military aviation training. His academic record was poor. Not catastrophically poor in the way of a student who has simply given up. There were flashes of capability, moments where the intelligence his tutors had noted broke through, but poor in the consistent structural way that indicates a young person who has never learned how to apply himself, who has never been taught that effort is necessary because consequences have never followed its absence. His disciplinary record was worse. He had been involved in incidents at school that, in the case of any other student, would have resulted in serious intervention. He was combative with teachers who challenged him. He was indifferent to rules that applied to everyone else. He had developed by 17 the particular personality of someone who has been taught by experience that the normal social contract, the exchange of compliance for belonging, of effort for reward, does not apply to him. And yet in 1938 he was enrolled in the Kachin Military Aviation School, one of the Soviet Union's most prestigious pilot training institutions. Stalin Sr. gave a specific instruction when his son was enrolled. The order, according to multiple sources who were familiar with the internal workings of the school during this period, was direct. Vasily was to receive no special treatment. He was to be evaluated by the same standards as every other cadet. He was to earn his place or not earn it, the same as anyone else. The school heard this instruction. The school smiled, nodded, and promptly ignored it. This is not entirely surprising when you think about it from the perspective of the officers who ran the institution. Here's the son of Joseph Stalin sitting in your classroom. Stalin, the man who has just concluded the Great Terror, who has had marshals of the Soviet Union arrested and shot, who has demonstrated in the most vivid possible terms that displeasure from above carries consequences that no sane person wants to experience. You are going to give his son failing grades. You are going to hold him back. You are going to put your name on a document that says formally and officially that Stalin's boy was not good enough. Of course not. You're going to find a way to make the numbers work. You're going to speak to the instructors before they submit their evaluations. You're going to ensure that the paperwork, when it is complete, tells a story that no one will be punished for telling. Vasily graduated from Kachin with outstanding marks. The word in Russian is otlично, excellent, top of the scale, the highest possible rating. His file recorded a performance that would have been remarkable from any student, and was, from him, a fiction so transparent that the people who had written it must have known, even as they signed their names, that they were participating in something that would one day have consequences they could not yet predict. He was certified as a military pilot. He was given his wings, and the lie that would follow him for the rest of his career was born. The front, 29 missions, and a rocket fishing trip. When the German invasion of the Soviet Union began in June of 1941, Vasily Stalin was 20 years old and held the rank of major, a rank he had received through the same mechanism that had gotten him through flight school. His father had issued instructions. His father's instructions had been formally to treat him like anyone else. The officers around him had formally done the exact opposite. He did fly combat missions. This is important to acknowledge because the historical record sometimes swings between two equally distorted poles, either treating Vasily as a genuine war hero or dismissing him as a complete fraud. The truth is more nuanced and, in its way, more interesting. He flew 29 combat sorties over the course of his active service. He was not a coward in the physical sense. He did not manufacture reasons to avoid the front, did not use his name to stay safely behind the lines when others were flying into danger. There was in him apparently a genuine desire to be part of something real, to do something that could not be falsified, to find in the cockpit an arena where the rules applied to everyone equally, because the sky does not care whose son you are, but the system would not allow even that small honesty. Every officer who approved his promotions was buying something. Every general who signed off on an advancement in his rank was making a calculation. This signature on this document advancing this particular young man, this signature earns me goodwill with the Father. It costs me nothing I can see right now. It buys me something I cannot measure but instinctively feel. A marginal improvement in my standing with the man who determines the fate of everyone around me. In 1942, within a single year of active service, Vasily went from major to colonel, 2 full ranks. In wartime, when promotion can legitimately come quickly because people above you are dying, but Vasily's promotions came not because the men above him were falling, but because the men below him were calculating. He was 21 years old and a colonel, and he had not earned it, and somewhere inside him. This is speculation, but it is informed speculation. He knew it in the way that people always know at the deepest level when the applause they are receiving is for a performance they did not actually give. And then came the fishing trip, the incident that defined everything. In 1943, Vasily Stalin organized what can only be described with the full weight of historical irony as a recreational outing. He was stationed near the front. He had access to military aircraft and military ordnance, and he decided, apparently, that the most entertaining use of that afternoon would be to go fishing using aviation rockets. This is not a metaphor. This is not embellishment. The historical record confirms that Vasily and a group of companions went to a body of water and used military rockets to stun or kill fish, a method that, while effective in a certain brutal way, requires the user to be in proximity to explosions of significant force. It went wrong. A military engineer who was part of the group was killed. Vasily was wounded, though not critically. The incident was reported up the chain of command. It reached Stalin. Stalin's response was, by the standards of what he was capable of, relatively restrained. which tells us something about the complicated nature of his relationship with his son. He did not have Vasily arrested. He did not have him shot, which, to be absolutely clear, is what would have happened to anyone else in the Soviet military who had killed a colleague through this kind of reckless stupidity. He signed a personal order, Stalin himself, his own hand, his own signature, removing Vasily from command. The charges on the order were specific: drunkenness and debauchery. The language of the document was stern. Stalin used the formal vocabulary of military discipline, the cold official phrasing that left no room for sentimentality. Reading the order, you might think, here, finally, is a moment of genuine accountability. Here's a father who, despite everything, is holding his son to a standard. But the order was signed in the autumns of 1943. By the spring of 1944, Vasily was back in command. He had been reinstated. He had been promoted again. And in 1945, at the age of 24, he became the youngest general major in the history of the Red Army. 24 years old, a general. The man who had been removed for killing a colleague through reckless conduct. The man whose grades at flight school had been fabricated. The man who had been promoted, not through demonstrated excellence, but through the fear that his name inspired in every officer who touched his file. That man was now a general of the Soviet Union. The architecture of false success. It is worth pausing here to examine the mechanism at work, because it is not as simple as corruption. Corruption in the ordinary sense implies a choice. Someone who knows the right thing to do and chooses the wrong thing for personal gain. What surrounded Vasily Stalin was something more systemic, more insidious, and in some ways more damaging. Every officer who falsified his grades, approved his promotions, or looked the other way at his misconduct was operating rationally within the incentive structure of the Soviet system. That system created one overwhelming priority: avoid the displeasure of those above you. Everything else, truth, fairness, the accurate assessment of a young man's capabilities, was subordinate to that single imperative. No individual officer decided to ruin Vasily Stalin. No one sat in a room and plotted the construction of a man who would believe his own fraudulent reputation. They were all simply doing what the system rewarded them for doing, managing upward, protecting themselves, turning every interaction with Stalin's son into an opportunity to purchase a small measure of safety. The result, accumulated across years and dozens of officers and hundreds of individual decisions, was a young man who had been systematically deprived of the one thing that might have saved him: honest feedback. He had never been told clearly and without the cushion of flattery what he was actually capable of. He had never been allowed to experience the full weight of his failures. He had never been given the opportunity to rebuild after genuine defeat, to discover in himself the resilience that only comes from confronting real consequences. Instead, every failure had been absorbed by the system. Every shortcoming had been quietly erased from the record. Every disaster had been followed by a promotion. What does that teach a person about the relationship between action and consequence? It teaches them that the relationship does not exist. It teaches them that what matters is not what you do, but who you are, or rather, whose son you are. It teaches them that the rules that govern other people are not rules that govern you. And it teaches them this so thoroughly, over such a long period, with such consistent reinforcement, that the lesson becomes not a conscious belief, but a bone-deep assumption that shapes every decision they make. Vasily Stalin was not born believing he was above accountability. He was taught it, carefully, systematically, by a system that had no interest in his development as a human being and every interest in maintaining the goodwill of his father. The loneliness inside the legend. There is one more thing to say about Vasily's military career, and it is the thing that the official documents, the promotion orders, the commendation files, the falsified evaluations, cannot capture. He was lonely, not in the obvious way of someone who has no companions. He was surrounded by people, always, everywhere, the way powerful men in the Soviet system were always surrounded by people: staff, subordinates, fellow officers, the various hangers-on who attached themselves to proximity to the Stalin name. There was never a shortage of bodies in his orbit, but genuine companionship, the kind built on honesty, on mutual vulnerability, on the shared experience of being truly known by another person, was impossible for him. How do you build honest friendship when everyone around you is performing? When every person who sits across the table from you is simultaneously calculating what your friendship might be worth and what your displeasure might cost? When the warmth directed at you is never quite separable from the fear that produces it? He could not know in any given interaction whether the laughter around him was genuine or obligatory. He could not know whether the men who called him a great pilot believed it or were simply afraid to say otherwise. He could not know whether the women who sought his company were drawn to him or to his name. This is the specific loneliness of power without legitimacy, the isolation of a man who cannot trust the reality of anything around him because the system has ensured that everything around him is a performance staged for his benefit. He drank more. The drinking that had begun at 13, that had already cost him a reprimand from his own father, deepened and widened as the years of the war went on. It was not recreational. It was not even fully habitual in the way that habits are chosen. It was structural, a response to a reality that had become, without the numbing of alcohol, too unstable and too lonely to inhabit. The end of the war, the beginning of the fall, when Germany surrendered in May of 1945 and the guns finally fell silent. Across the Eastern Front, Vasily Stalin was 24 years old and a general of the Red Army. From the outside, it looked like the beginning of something, a decorated young officer, son of the supreme leader, still young enough to build an entire career ahead of him. The Soviet Union was a superpower now, standing alongside the Americans and the British in the ruins of a remade world, and the future seemed full of possibility for a man in his position. But from inside the particular life that Vasily had been living, inside the specific damage that had been accumulating since before he could remember, it looked different. He was 24 years old, and he'd never done anything that was entirely his own. Every rank he held had been given to him. Every commendation in his file had been written by someone who was afraid of his father. Every door that had opened for him had opened because of his name, and every person who had helped him through it had done so not out of respect for him, but out of calculation about the man whose son he was. He had 29 real combat missions and an entire career built on fiction around them. He had a father who had, on one occasion, signed a personal order against him, and who had, on every other occasion, allowed the system to absorb his failures without consequence. He had a general's stars on his shoulders and the weight of every lie that had put them there pressing down beneath them. The post-war years, as we will see in the next chapter of this investigation, would give him power he had never been prepared for, and would produce disasters that, in retrospect, were not surprising at all. They were the inevitable result of a machine set in motion years earlier, grinding forward now under its own accumulated momentum, heading toward a wreckage that everyone around him could see and no one was willing to name. The false stars on his shoulders were beautiful. They were also, every one of them, borrowed. And borrowed things in the Soviet Union always had to be returned. Power in the right hands is a tool. In the wrong hands, not the hands of evil necessarily, but the hands of someone who was never prepared for it, never taught to respect it, never allowed to understand the weight of what it means to hold authority over other human beings. Power is something else entirely. It is an accelerant. It takes whatever is already burning inside a person and feeds it oxygen until the fire grows beyond any possibility of containment. By 1947, Vasily Stalin was 26 years old and had been appointed commander of the air forces of the Moscow Military District. Let that settle for a moment. 26 years old, commander of the air forces surrounding the capital of the largest country on earth, responsible for the aircraft, the pilots, the personnel, and the operations of a military district that sat at the very center of Soviet power, a position that a career officer might spend 30 years working toward. that required not just technical knowledge, but strategic thinking, administrative capability, and the kind of mature judgment that only comes from years of genuine experience, from failing, recovering, learning, and failing again. Vasily had none of that. He had a name. He had a uniform. He had the borrowed stars we examined in the last chapter, and he had, surrounding him on all sides, the same machinery of flattery and fear that had followed him since childhood. The same officers who had learned over years of careful observation that honest assessment of Stalin's son was a career-ending exercise, and that enthusiastic agreement was the only truly safe response. He was walking into a position that would have challenged the most capable officer in the Soviet military. He was not the most capable officer in the Soviet military. He was a 26-year-old man with unresolved grief, a deepening drinking problem, no genuine experience of sustained accountability, and a self-image that had been constructed entirely from materials provided by people who were afraid of him. The stage was set, the machinery was running, and the disasters, when they came with the terrible logic of things that were always going to happen. The VVS Club. A general plays at Empire One of the first things Vasily did with his new command was build something that was, in its way, entirely characteristic of who he was and what he had been taught to value. He built a sports empire, the VVSMVO, the Air Forces of the Moscow Military District, had existed as a sports club in various forms before Vasily took command. But under his direction, it became something else, a personal project on a scale that only someone with unlimited access to military resources and no meaningful oversight could have constructed. He wanted the best football team in the Soviet Union. He wanted the best hockey team. He wanted basketball, swimming, athletics. He wanted, in essence, a private sporting empire that would bear his initials and demonstrate to the world that VVSMVO was not simply a military unit, but something grander, something that reflected the prestige of the man who ran it. And he had the means to make it happen, because the means were not his to deploy, they were the state's, and the state in the form of the military district he commanded was entirely at his disposal. He recruited players by the simple expedient of having them transferred into his unit. If he wanted a footballer from Spartak Moscow or Dynamo Kiev, he arranged a military transfer. The player had no choice in the matter. This was the Soviet Union in the late 1940s, and a military transfer order was not a negotiation. The player arrived, put on the V versus MVO jersey, and played for Vasily's team. The resources he directed toward his clubs, the facilities, the equipment, the training staff, the support personnel, came from military budgets that were meant for other purposes. The accountants who noticed the discrepancies chose, with the characteristic wisdom of Soviet bureaucrats, not to notice them too loudly. For a few years, the VVSMVO clubs were genuinely formidable. The football team competed at the highest level of Soviet football. The hockey team, assembled from talent recruited across the country, was building towards something real. And then came January of 1950. The crash that was never announced on the 5th of January, 1950. The VVSMVO hockey team boarded an aircraft near Sverdlovsk, the city we now know as Yekaterinburg, deep in the Ural Mountains. They were traveling to a match. The weather was poor. The aircraft, a Li-2 transport, went down shortly after takeoff. 19 people died. Among them were the core of the hockey team that Vasily had spent years assembling. Players he had recruited from across the Soviet Union, young men in the prime of their athletic lives, some of them among the most talented hockey players in the country. 19 people. In any normal military or civilian organization, a disaster of this magnitude would trigger an immediate response. Notifications to families, official announcements, an investigation into the cause, a period of institutional mourning. The machinery of accountability and public information would grind into motion, painful and slow, but it would move. Vasily Stalin did none of those things. What he did instead, and this detail, preserved in the historical record and confirmed by multiple sources, is one of the most revealing moments in his entire story, was cover it up. He did not report the crash through official channels. He did not inform the relevant authorities in the way that a commander was required to. He did not allow the families of the dead players to be notified through proper channels. He suppressed the information, managing it personally and keeping it away from the official record with the kind of frantic, desperate energy of a man who has just done something catastrophic and knows it. And then, in a move that tells you everything about the psychology of a person who has spent his entire life watching reality be rewritten, he went out the next day and recruited a replacement team. Within 24 hours of the crash that killed 19 people, Vasily had assembled a new VVSMVO hockey squad by the same method he had always used. Forced transfers, a phone call here, an order there, players arriving from other clubs without fully understanding why they had been moved. The new team played the scheduled match. The result was recorded in the official records. The names of the 19 dead men were not. The cover-up held for decades. The families of the players waited for information that never came through official channels. The crash itself was not publicly acknowledged in the Soviet Union until long after Stalin's death, long after the system that had produced both the tragedy and its concealment had already begun its slow collapse. For the people directly affected, the parents, the wives, the children of the men who died near Sverdlovsk on that January morning, the silence was not just grief, it was a second injury. The deliberate denial of the acknowledgement that might have helped them begin to heal. Why did Vasily do it? The answer is written clearly in the logic of his entire life. He was terrified of his father, not in the abstract way that children fear disapproval, though that element was certainly present. He was terrified in the specific, concrete way of a man who knew, better than almost anyone alive, what Stalin did to people who brought him bad news, who failed in their responsibilities, who demonstrated through their failures that they were not worthy of the trust placed in them. He had been given command of the Moscow district's air forces. Under his command, an aircraft carrying his team had gone down and 19 people were dead. His father would hear about this. His father would form an opinion about what it meant. And Vasily's entire history, his entire experience of his father's attention, the coldness, the withdrawal, the rare moments of warmth that were always conditional and never reliable, had taught him one overwhelming lesson. Do not give Stalin a reason to look at you with that particular expression, so he erased it. The way things were erased in the Soviet Union, quickly, efficiently, without sentiment. And it worked. For the moment, it worked. The system that enabled the silence. Here we must pause and ask an uncomfortable question. Vasily did not cover up the Sverdlovsk crash alone. He could not have. The suppression of an incident involving 19 deaths, military personnel, a military aircraft, an official team representing a military district, required the cooperation, or at minimum the deliberate inaction of multiple officials. Reports that should have been filed were not filed. Notifications that should have gone up the chain of command did not go. Records that should have existed were managed in ways that made the crash functionally invisible. Every person who participated in that silence made a choice, and every one of those people made the same choice for the same reason, because Vasily Stalin's name was on the door of the commander's office, and everyone in the Soviet military apparatus had been trained over years of watching what happened to people who crossed the Stalin family, to make choices that preserved their own safety above everything else. This is how the system worked, not through direct orders to commit specific acts of wrongdoing, but through the creation of an environment in which the path of least resistance and the path of self-preservation both pointed in the same direction, away from truth, away from accountability, away from the difficult and dangerous act of saying what had actually happened. Vasily did not create that environment. He had inherited it, along with everything else. He had also by this point become its most willing resident. The parade that broke everything. For 2 years after the Sverdlovsk crash, the cover held. The hockey team was rebuilt. The VSMVO clubs continued to compete. Vasily continued in his role as commander, drinking heavily, making decisions with the impulsive disregard for consequence that had characterized every chapter of his life. surrounded by officers who told him what he wanted to hear and subordinates who feared him too much to tell him anything else. And then came May of 1952, Aviation Day, one of the grand ceremonial occasions of the Soviet calendar, a day of aerial displays and military pageantry, of formations of aircraft crossing the Moscow sky while crowds gathered below, and the leadership of the Soviet state watched from their viewing positions, and the propaganda machinery hummed with satisfied efficiency. The weather on the day of the planned parade was wrong. This was not a minor inconvenience. Aviation parades require specific visibility conditions. The aircraft involved, in this case including Tupolev Tu-4 strategic bombers, heavy and demanding aircraft that required experienced crews operating under favorable conditions, were not suited for flight in low visibility and poor atmospheric conditions. Every qualified aviation officer around Vasily knew this. The conditions were not safe for the planned display. Vasily gave the order to proceed anyway. 2 Tupolev Tu-4 bombers crashed, not damaged, not forced to make emergency landings, crashed in front of the gathered crowds in full public view on one of the most symbolically important military occasions in the Soviet year. Stalin received word. There was no cover-up this time. The crashes had happened in public in Moscow, on a day when half the party leadership was watching. There was nothing to manage, no record to adjust, no way to make 19 witnesses forget what they had seen with their own eyes. Vasily was removed from command. The dismissal was not accompanied by arrest, not yet. That would come later, and from different hands than his father's. It was simply a termination. He was relieved of his position as commander of the Moscow district's air forces, and given no replacement assignment. He was, in the language of military administration, essentially parked, suspended in a kind of official limbo that communicated displeasure without yet delivering judgment. He was 31 years old. His career, to all practical purposes, was over. The man behind the disasters. It would be easy, at this point in the story, to render a clean verdict. Vasily Stalin was reckless and irresponsible. He covered up a mass casualty incident. He ordered an unsafe military parade and people died. He misused military resources for personal vanity projects. He drank through his responsibilities and filled his command with people chosen for their willingness to flatter rather than their professional competence. All of that is true. All of it is documented. None of it is in serious dispute. But a verdict is not the same thing as an understanding, and understanding requires one more step, the step that takes us back, always, to the question of how a person becomes what they become. Vasily Stalin had never been taught to manage power responsibly because no one in his life had ever modeled responsible power. His father's relationship with authority was, to put it with maximum understatement, not characterized by restraint, accountability, or concern for the human cost of decisions. The men around his father, the senior officials, the generals, the party secretaries who populated Vasily's childhood and adolescence, were not models of careful stewardship. They were men who had survived in the most dangerous political environment in the world by being exactly the kind of people who did not say the difficult, honest, inconvenient thing. Vasily had inherited a conception of power that was essentially his father's conception. Power is something you exercise because you have it, not something you hold in trust for the people beneath you. He had inherited a relationship with accountability that the system had spent his entire life reinforcing. Consequences are for other people. Problems can be managed. Reality can be adjusted. When the reality in question was a crashed aircraft full of dead hockey players, he managed it the way he had been taught to manage everything inconvenient, by making it disappear. When the reality was a safety assessment telling him that the weather was wrong for an air show, he dismissed it the way he had been taught to dismiss every obstacle to what he wanted, by the exercise of authority that no one around him was positioned to challenge. He was not a monster. He was something more complicated, a man shaped by forces that were, in their own way, as totalitarian as the system that had produced them. A man who had been denied, at every turn, the experiences that might have made him something different. The last months of a world built on his name, between his dismissal in May of 1952 and the death of his father in March of 1953, Vasily existed in a kind of suspended animation. He had no command. He had no assignment. He had the rank, the name, the apartment, the various material trappings of his position, but the substance had been removed. He was a general with nothing to command, a son whose father had once again turned away from him at a critical moment and offered no explanation and no guidance. He drank. He waited. He must have understood at some level that something was ending, that the particular configuration of the world that had shaped his entire life was not stable, that his father was aging, that the system that had simultaneously destroyed and protected him could not hold its shape forever. But understanding that something is ending is very different from being prepared for what comes after. Vasily Stalin was not prepared. He had never been prepared for anything in his life. And the morning of the 5th of March, 1953, when the phone calls began and the news spread through the corridors of Soviet power that Joseph Stalin was dead. On that morning, the last support that had held Vasily's world together was removed, and the structure that had been compromised for decades finally, completely began to fall. There is a moment in the life of every person who has lived in the shadow of another, whether that shadow was cast by love, by fear, or by the particular combination of both that Vasily Stalin had spent his entire life navigating, when the shadow lifts. Sometimes that moment is liberation. Sometimes it is annihilation. For Vasily, it was both at once, arriving on the same morning, indistinguishable from each other, wrapped together in the news that traveled through the corridors of the Kremlin and the telephone lines of Moscow's military elite on the 5th of March, 1953. Joseph Stalin was dead, the man who had simultaneously protected and destroyed his son, who had given him a name worth more than any rank and withheld from him every form of genuine love, who had promoted him and dismissed him, who had signed orders against him and then allowed those orders to be quietly reversed, who had been the sun around which Vasily's entire existence had helplessly orbited, was gone. And in the silence that followed that news, a silence that lasted perhaps a few hours at most before the machinery of power began its brutal reorganization, Vasily Stalin discovered something that he had perhaps always suspected, but had never been forced to confront directly. The name meant nothing without the man behind it. The deathbed. A son arrives drunk and screaming. The accounts of Stalin's final days are well documented by now. The stroke, the long hours in the Kuntsevo dacha, the circle of terrified senior officials gathered around the dying man's bed, each of them calculating with cold precision what the death would mean for their own survival and their own position in the world that would come after. Vasily was brought to the dacha. He arrived drunk. This single detail, recorded by multiple witnesses who were present in those final hours, contains an entire world of information about the man Vasily had become and the family he had grown up in. His father was dying, the most powerful figure in the history of the Soviet Union, the man whose approval Vasily had chased every day of his life, was taking his last breaths in a room full of people who were too frightened even to call a doctor promptly. And Vasily, the son, arrived in a state that announced to everyone in that room exactly how he had been managing the accumulated weight of his own existence. He did not weep quietly. He did not stand at the bedside in dignified grief. He shouted. He declared, loudly and repeatedly, that his father had been poisoned, that the men in that room, the men who would shortly become the new rulers of the Soviet Union, who were at that very moment preparing to inherit the power that Stalin was releasing with his last breaths, had murdered him. That what was happening was not a natural death, but a political crime. Was he right? The historical debate about whether Stalin's death involved deliberate medical neglect or something more calculated has never been fully resolved. There are historians who argue that the delay in calling doctors was not innocent, that the men gathered at Kuntsevo had their own reasons to allow events to proceed without urgent medical intervention. Vasily's accusation was not, from a strictly historical perspective, entirely without foundation. But it did not matter whether he was right. What mattered was that he was making the accusation, loudly, to the faces of the men who were about to become the most powerful people in the Soviet Union. In a room where everyone understood that the era of one set of rules was ending and a new set of rules, not yet fully defined, but already beginning to take shape in the minds of the men who would write them, was about to begin. He was escorted out. The door closed behind him, and the men who remained in that room, who would become the collective leadership of the post-Stalin Soviet Union, Beria, Khrushchev, Malenkov, Bulganin, and the rest, began the work of figuring out what to do with the man who had just screamed at them that they were murderers. The vanishing of the court. In the days immediately following Stalin's death, days that were, for the Soviet elite, a period of extraordinary fluidity and danger, a moment when old allegiances were being abandoned and new ones were being formed, with the speed and desperation of people rearranging deck chairs above a waterline that was rising faster than anyone wanted to admit. Vasily discovered something that should not have surprised him, but clearly did. Everyone left, not all at once, not in a dramatic departure, but with the quiet, efficient, entirely predictable logic of people who had never actually been there for him, who had been there for the name, for the access, for the marginal protection that proximity to Stalin's son had offered. They simply stopped calling, stopped visiting, stopped being available when he reached out. The officers who had flattered him for years were suddenly busy with other priorities. The subordinates who had laughed at his jokes and agreed with his decisions and looked the other way at his excesses found, abruptly, that their schedules did not accommodate the same easy access they had previously offered. The various hangers-on, the social companions, the people who had filled his evenings and his apartments and his orbit, they redistributed themselves with the unsentimental efficiency of people who understand that the value of a connection is determined entirely by what it can currently offer. Within weeks of Stalin's death, Vasily was functionally alone. Not literally alone. There were still people around him always. But he was surrounded now by absence-wearing human faces, by people who were present in the room but were no longer truly there in any way that mattered. The new leadership, Beria's coalition, then Khrushchev's emerging dominance, approached him with what appeared, on the surface, to be reasonable generosity. They offered him a military position, not in Moscow, not at the center of things, but a genuine command somewhere in the provinces, a way to remain part of the system, to continue his career, to exist within the structure that had defined his entire life. He refused. This refusal is one of the most psychologically revealing moments in his entire story. From a purely rational standpoint, it made no sense. He had no power base. He had no allies. He had a history full of documented failures and at least one covered-up catastrophe. The offer of a provincial command was, under the circumstances, more generous than he had any right to expect. But accepting it would have meant accepting a diminishment. It would have meant acknowledging that the world had changed, that the name no longer carried what it once had, that he was not the commander of the Moscow military district or the son of the supreme leader, but simply a middle-aged general with a complicated past and no particular future, starting over in some city far from the capital where no one would be afraid of him. He could not do it. His entire identity was built on a foundation that had just been removed, and he had no other foundation to stand on. He had never been allowed to build one. He stayed in Moscow. He drank. He said loudly and to anyone who would listen things about the new leadership that no rational person said loudly in the Soviet Union in the spring of 1953. The new leadership waited exactly 54 days after Stalin's death. April 28, 1953, 54 days. That is how long it took for the Soviet state. The system that had created Vasily Stalin elevated him, protected him, enabled him, and then discarded him the moment he ceased to be useful. To move from the death of his father to his arrest. On the 28th of April, 1953, Vasily Yosifovich Stalin was arrested. The charges assembled against him were extensive: anti-Soviet agitation, specifically his public declarations that his father had been murdered, a claim that the new leadership found both inconvenient and potentially dangerous. Embezzlement and misuse of military funds, the sports empire, the forced transfers, the redirected budgets that had built the VO clubs, assault and battery of subordinates. There were documented incidents, confirmed by multiple witnesses, of Vasily using physical force against people under his command, criminal negligence resulting in death, a charge that covered, among other things, the parade disaster of 1952, and, though it was not yet fully formalized in the documentation, the shadow of the Sverdlovsk crash hung over the proceedings as well. It is important to be honest about this moment, because the temptation in any story of this kind is to paint the arrested man as entirely innocent, as a political victim whose charges were fabricated from nothing. The reality of Vasily's case was more complicated and, in its way, more interesting. Some of the charges were politically motivated. The anti-Soviet agitation charge was essentially a way of criminalizing the grief and rage of a drunk man who had accused the wrong people of the wrong thing at the wrong time. In a different political environment, in a different family, those outbursts would have been treated as what they were, the behavior of a man in acute psychological distress following the death of his father. But the other charges, the embezzlement, the violence against subordinates, the negligence, were substantially documented. The paper trail existed. The witnesses were available. The pattern of behavior was confirmed across multiple incidents and multiple years. The Soviet system had spent 2 decades enabling everything it was now prosecuting. That is not a defense of the charges. The victims of Vasily's behavior, the subordinates he had struck, the families of the 19 men who died near Sverdlovsk and were never officially mourned, the pilots who had crashed at the 1952 parade. They were real. Their injuries were real. Their deaths were real. But the system that now stood in judgment of him was the same system that had made him what he was, the same system that had falsified his grades and manufactured his promotions and removed every meaningful obstacle from his path and replaced every honest voice in his life with a chorus of flattery and fear. The system that had built him into this was now, with perfect bureaucratic efficiency, presenting him with the bill. Vladimir prison, the erasure of a name. He received 8 years. The sentence was handed down by a court in which, according to every account of the proceedings, not a single voice was raised in his defense, not one character witness, not one officer who stood up and said, whatever his faults, whatever his failures, the system that produced him bears some share of responsibility for what it made him into. Not one person who had benefited from his name, from his protection, from the access his friendship had provided, who was now willing to spend a fraction of that capital on his behalf. They had all calculated the new equations and reached the same conclusion. He was taken to Vladimir prison. Vladimir was not a labor camp. It was a maximum security political prison built in the 18th century, its walls thick with the specific dampness of a building that has been holding people against their will for 200 years. It housed, over the course of Soviet history, a particular category of prisoner, not criminals in the ordinary sense, but people whose existence was politically inconvenient, people who knew too much or were too prominent, or whose names created complications that required careful management. Vasily was placed in Vladimir under a name that was not his own. He was registered as Vasily Pavlovich Vasilyev, not Stalin, not Jugashvili, his father's actual birth name. Vasilyev, a name so generic, so unremarkable, so entirely without distinguishing characteristics, that it communicated perfectly what the new leadership wanted to communicate about the man who carried it. You are no one. The name that gave you everything has been taken away. You exist now as a number in a register, as a body in a cell, as a file in a cabinet that will be reviewed when it is convenient and forgotten when it is not. The specific cruelty of this particular erasure deserves attention. For a man whose entire identity had been constructed around a name, who had never been allowed to develop a self that existed independently of that name, who had been praised and feared and promoted and indulged not for who he was, but for whose son he was. The removal of the name was not just an administrative act, it was an existential one. It reached into the very center of whatever sense of self he had managed to construct and removed the single structural element on which everything else depended. Who was Vasily Vasilyev? Nobody. A prisoner in Vladimir, a body requiring food and water, in a cell with 4 walls, a name in a register. He had spent his whole life unable to escape Stalin's shadow. Now he was unable to claim it. The silence of 8 years' prison records from Vladimir during Vasily's incarceration are incomplete and, in some cases, deliberately obscured. The Soviet state was not, as a general principle, interested in creating detailed documentation of the inner lives of its inconvenient prisoners. What we know comes from fragments. Accounts of guards who remembered him, reports filed by prison administrators, the occasional medical notation that marked the deterioration of his physical condition. He did not do well. The drinking that had structured his adult life was in prison impossible to maintain at the same level, and the absence of that crutch, combined with the confinement, the anonymity, and the specific psychological injury of being stripped of his identity, appears to have been devastating. His health began to decline in ways that went beyond the ordinary toll of incarceration. He wrote letters to the new leadership, to Khrushchev specifically, letters that ranged across a wide emotional register, from demands for reconsideration of his case to what appear to have been genuinely anguished attempts to articulate the injustice of his situation. He asked for review of the charges. He asked for acknowledgement. He asked in various ways and with varying degrees of coherence for someone in power to see him, not as Stalin's son, not as a political problem to be managed, but as a person whose life had gone catastrophically wrong and who deserved at least an honest accounting of why. The responses were bureaucratic, formal, carefully written to acknowledge receipt without conceding anything, to manage without engaging, to keep the problem contained without resolving it. No one came to see him. In the years he spent in Vladimir prison, not one senior official, not one former colleague, not one of the dozens of officers and functionaries who had spent years cultivating his friendship and his favor, not one of them made the journey to Vladimir to sit across from him and be honest with him. The silence around him was total, and in that silence, the final stripping away of everything he had ever been, the rank, the name, the manufactured reputation, the borrowed stars, continued its slow, quiet, merciless work. What the system owed and would not pay. There is a question that hangs over every chapter of this story, and it arrives with its full weight here, at the moment of his imprisonment. Did Vasily Stalin deserve to be in prison? The honest answer is, some of what he did warranted serious consequences. The assault of subordinates, the criminal negligence, the cover-up of the Sverdlovsk crash, which denied 19 families the basic human dignity of official acknowledgement of their loss. These were real wrongs committed against real people, and a system that valued accountability would have addressed them, but a system that valued accountability would have addressed them at the time they occurred, not 15 years later, not when it had become politically convenient, not by the same apparatus that had enabled every one of those wrongs and profited from the silence that surrounded them. The 8-year sentence handed down in 1953 was not justice. It was disposal. It was the Soviet system doing what the Soviet system did with extraordinary efficiency, identifying something that had served its purpose and was no longer useful, and removing it from view with the clean, dispassionate thoroughness of a bureaucracy that does not distinguish between outdated policy positions and human beings. Vasily Stalin had been created by that system. He had been used by it. He had been allowed to believe, for 31 years, that he was protected by it. And then, in 54 days, it had ended him, not with the violence that the system typically reserved for its most dangerous enemies, not with the drama of a show trial or the finality of a firing squad, but with something quieter and, in its way, more complete. A new name, a prison cell, and the systematic removal of every element of his identity that might have given him a reason to believe he still existed in any meaningful sense. He sat in Vladimir prison as Vasily Vasilyev, and the world outside continued without him, and the name he had never quite owned was quietly buried under the accelerating process of de-Stalinization that Khrushchev would formalize in 1956. And the boy who had started drinking at 13, who had lost his mother at 11, who had watched his only father figure disappear into the terror at 16, who had never once in his life been treated as simply a person rather than a symbol. That boy sat in a cell in an ancient prison and waited for something that was not coming. A name returned, a man already gone. In 1960, after serving the majority of his sentence, Vasily was released on grounds of deteriorating health. He was 39 years old. He looked older. He was sent back to Moscow, not as a rehabilitation, not as an acknowledgement that something had gone wrong, but as a managed release, the kind of carefully calibrated exit that the Soviet state offered to problems it wanted out of prison without wanting back in public life. He lasted less than a month in Moscow before the thing that ended him began, but that, the final chapter, the exile to Kazan, the last marriage, the last 2 years, and the death in the one-room apartment 2 days before his 41st birthday. That is the story of Part 6. What Part 5 leaves us with is this. A man spent 8 years in a prison under a name that was not his, for crimes that the system that convicted him had spent 2 decades enabling, tried in a court where no one spoke in his defense, serving a sentence that was less about justice than about the management of an inconvenience. And when he walked out of Vladimir prison in 1960, he was not a free man in any sense that the word can meaningfully carry. He was the remainder of a person. The residue left after everything that could be taken had been taken. The name was gone. The rank was gone. The career was gone. The court of flatterers was gone. The father whose shadow had simultaneously sheltered and suffocated him was gone. What remained was Vasily, just Vasily. And the tragedy, the deepest, most irreducible tragedy in this entire story, is that no one had ever taught him who that was. There is a particular kind of freedom that looks from the outside exactly like its opposite. When Vasily Stalin walked out of Vladimir prison in 1960, he was technically a free man. The gates opened. The guards did not stop him. The paperwork had been processed, the signatures gathered, the administrative machinery of release set in motion and completed. He was no longer a prisoner. But freedom in any genuine sense requires more than the absence of walls. It requires a life to walk back into, a structure, a identity, a set of relationships and purposes, and forward-looking possibilities that give the open air its meaning. It requires a self that has been preserved or rebuilt, or at minimum not so thoroughly dismantled that the person standing in the open air has no idea what to do with the space in front of him. Vasily had none of that. He had his body, which was deteriorating. He had his memories, which were a catalog of losses too extensive to fully inventory. He had the particular psychological residue of 8 years in a cell under a name that was not his own. 8 years of silence, of bureaucratic non-existence, of being treated as a problem rather than a person by every institution and individual that had encountered him. And he had Moscow. For a few weeks, he had Moscow. The return that was not a return. The city he came back to in 1960 was not the city he had left in 1953. Khrushchev's secret speech of 1956, the address to the 20th Party Congress in which the new Soviet leader had, in carefully calibrated but historically unprecedented terms, denounced Stalin's cult of personality and acknowledged the crimes of the terror, had restructured the Soviet Union's relationship with its own recent past. The man whose name Vasily carried had been officially, if incompletely, disgraced. His portrait had been coming down from walls. His body had been removed from the Lenin mausoleum where it had lain beside the revolution's founder and reburied outside the Kremlin wall in a ceremony of deliberate diminishment. Vasily came back into a world that was actively trying to forget his father, which meant, by extension, a world that was actively trying to forget him. He was not rehabilitated in any formal sense. He was released. There is a significant difference. Rehabilitation in Soviet political vocabulary meant a restoration of status, an acknowledgement that the conviction had been unjust, a return of rank and the social standing that accompanied it. Release meant only that the state had decided, for its own reasons, that continued incarceration was more trouble than it was worth. He had no rank. He had no assignment. He had the pension of a retired military officer, modest, barely sufficient for a single person living carefully, and an apartment in Moscow, and the knowledge settling over him daily with increasing weight that the city he had once commanded from the heights of military authority now had no particular place for him. He reached out to old contacts. Some of them responded cautiously, the way people respond to someone they once knew well and are no longer sure how to categorize. Others did not respond at all. The careful social mathematics of Soviet life. Who is safe to be seen with? Who carries too much risk? Who represents a connection that is more liability than asset? Had been calculated, and the results were clear. He was not safe to be seen with. He was not an asset. He was a complication. The Chinese consulate, the last mistake. In April of 1960, less than a month after his release from Vladimir prison, Vasily Stalin walked into the Chinese consulate in Moscow. What exactly he said there, what he was seeking, what he imagined would come from that meeting, the documentary record is incomplete, and the various accounts that have emerged over the years contain enough contradictions to suggest that the full truth of that conversation may never be fully recovered. What is clear is what happened next. The following day, he was arrested again. The rearrest came with a speed that speaks to how closely he was being watched, which is to say, very closely indeed. The Soviet security apparatus had not released Vasily Stalin and then taken its eyes off him. He had been under surveillance from the moment he walked out of Vladimir, and the visit to the Chinese consulate at a moment when Sino-Soviet relations were deteriorating and the ideological split between Moscow and Beijing was becoming impossible to paper over, was precisely the kind of action that the security services had been waiting for. Whether Vasily understood this, whether he had thought through the implications of walking into a foreign diplomatic mission at that particular moment in Soviet history is impossible to know. What the action suggests at minimum is a man whose judgment had been so thoroughly eroded by decades of institutional damage and years of imprisonment that the basic calculus of survival in the Soviet system, the calculus that every Soviet citizen learned from childhood, had ceased to function in any reliable way. He was not sent back to Vladimir. He was sent to Kazan. The name returned, the man destroyed. The exile to Kazan came with one of the most deliberately cruel administrative details in this entire story, a detail so perfectly calibrated in its psychological precision that it reads, even now, as a kind of malicious artistry. By order of the authorities, Vasily was told that he would no longer use the name Vasiliev, the false name under which he had spent 8 years in Vladimir. He would also not be permitted to use the name Stalin. He would be known officially and in all documentation as Vasily Yosifovich Djugashvili, his father's birth name, the name from before the revolution, from before the transformation of the Georgian seminary student Yosif Djugashvili into the steel-named leader of world communism. A name that was, in the context of Soviet 1960, simultaneously real and obscure. Real in the genealogical sense, obscure in the sense that it carried none of the recognition, none of the resonance, none of the weight of the name that had been taken from him. They had taken Stalin and given him back something that looked from a distance like an identity, but was in practice a name that meant nothing to anyone, a name that opened no doors, that commanded no attention, that guaranteed nothing except the bureaucratic satisfaction of having something to write in the appropriate boxes on the appropriate forms. He was sent to Kazan with this name and a prohibition against leaving the city, and a small apartment and the understanding, communicated through the specific language of Soviet administrative exile, that his continued liberty was conditional on his continued invisibility. Be quiet, stay small, do not make yourself a problem. These were the terms. Kazan, the city at the end of everything. Kazan in 1960 was a city of nearly 700,000 people, an industrial center, a university town, the capital of the Tatar Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, a place with its own history and culture and character entirely unrelated to the man who had been deposited within its borders by the machinery of Soviet political management. For Vasily, it was exile in the most complete sense of the word. Not exile to a foreign country, not exile to Siberia. The dramatic varieties of banishment that Soviet history had made famous, this was something quieter and in its way more complete. Exile to ordinariness. Exile to a city where no one knew him, where the name Djugashvili meant nothing to the woman at the bread shop or the doctor at the clinic or the neighbors in the adjacent apartments of whatever building he had been assigned to live in. He was nobody. After a lifetime of being somebody, of being somebody's son, of being the bearer of a name that changed every room he entered, of being surrounded by people whose behavior toward him was shaped entirely by who his father was, he was for the first time entirely, completely, irreversibly nobody. There is something almost unbearable about imagining what that felt like. Not the imprisonment. Prison, for all its horror, had a structure, a logic, a set of rules and routines that organized time and gave each day a shape. Prison was, in its terrible way, still a place inside the system, still a place where the state was paying attention to you, still a place where your existence registered on someone's paperwork. This was different. This was the state's final statement on the subject of Vasily Stalin. You are not worth imprisoning anymore. You are not worth watching. You are not worth the administrative effort of continued surveillance. Go to Kazan. Become Djugashvili. Disappear into the ordinary grain of Soviet life. He could not disappear. He did not know how. The last marriage in January of 1962, Vasily Stalin married for the last time. Her name was Maria Nussberg. She was a nurse. The details of how they met, of what drew them together, of what their relationship looked like in the brief months it lasted are not extensively documented. What the historical record preserves is the bare fact of the marriage, the date, the names, the registration, and the accounts of those who knew them in Kazan during those final months. She was, by all accounts, genuinely kind to him. This deserves to be said plainly, without irony or qualification. In the last period of his life, there was a woman who chose to be with him not because of his name, not because of his father, not because of any calculation about what proximity to him might offer. She was a nurse in Kazan. She had no particular stake in Soviet political history. She was simply a person who had encountered another person in distress and had chosen, with the quiet courage of ordinary human decency, to stay. It was the first genuinely chosen relationship of his adult life. It lasted less than 3 months. March 19th, 1962. The morning of the 19th of March, 1962 was unremarkable by every external measure. Kazan was Kazan, the same streets, the same gray Soviet architecture, the same rhythm of ordinary Soviet life that moved through its daily motions with the particular combination of resignation and resilience that characterized existence in the late Khrushchev era. People went to work. Children went to school. The city breathed in and breathed out. In a one-room apartment, Vasily Yosifovich Djugashvili, formerly known as Vasily Stalin, formerly known as Vasily Vasilyev, son of the man who had ruled the Soviet Union for nearly 3 decades, died. He was 40 years old. He had been born on the 21st of March, 1921. He died 2 days before his 41st birthday. The cause of death was, in the clinical language of the medical report, alcohol-related organ failure. His liver, his heart, the accumulated physiological toll of decades of drinking that had begun at 13 and had never, not once in the 27 years since, been properly addressed or treated or even acknowledged as the symptom it had always been. It all converged in that one-room apartment in Kazan on that March morning, and his body simply stopped. There were no state honors. There was no military salute. There was no obituary in Pravda, no announcement on Soviet radio, no acknowledgement from the leadership in Moscow that a man had died, that the son of Joseph Stalin had come to the end of the road that had begun in a Moscow apartment in 1921 when his father had turned away from his mother because he had wanted a daughter. He was buried in Kazan under the name Jugashvili. The grave was modest, the ceremony was small. The world moved on with the indifference that it always shows toward the deaths of people who were once famous and are famous no longer. What the system created, what the system destroyed. Now, standing at the end of this story, we owe it to the truth to hold two things at once. The first is this: Vasily Stalin was not innocent. He assaulted people under his command. That is documented and confirmed. He covered up the Sverdlovsk crash and denied 19 families the basic human right of official acknowledgement of their loss. That is documented and confirmed. He ordered an unsafe military parade and people died. That is documented and confirmed. He directed military resources toward his personal vanity projects in ways that constituted genuine misappropriation of public funds. That is documented and confirmed. These were real wrongs. They had real victims. A system that genuinely valued accountability would have addressed them, would have held him responsible, would have imposed consequences proportionate to the harm done. The second thing is this: the system that prosecuted those wrongs was the same system that created them. Every officer who falsified his grades taught him that standards did not apply to him. Every general who promoted him beyond his competence taught him that rank was not something you earned, but something that was given. Every flatterer who laughed at his jokes and agreed with his decisions and looked the other way at his misconduct taught him that the social contract, the mutual accountability that makes functioning communities possible, was for other people. The Soviet system built Vasily Stalin with the same systematic thoroughness that it built everything else, completely, efficiently, and with no consideration whatsoever for the human cost of what it was producing. And then, when the product was no longer useful, when the name that had given him his value had been officially disgraced, and the man behind it was dead, and the new leadership needed to demonstrate that they were something different from what had come before, the system did what it always did with things that were no longer useful. It discarded him with paperwork, with bureaucratic precision, with the particular cold efficiency of an apparatus that had never treated him as a person and saw no reason to start now. The question that has no comfortable answer: what could have been different? It is a question worth asking, even knowing that history does not operate in hypotheticals. If Vasily had been held to genuine standards at Kachin, if the instructors had graded him honestly, had failed him where he failed, had required him to earn what he was given, what would have happened? Perhaps he would have washed out. Perhaps he would have found a path to actual competence through the particular alchemy that genuine challenge sometimes produces in people who have never been genuinely challenged. If, after the Sverdlovsk crash, someone had gone to him, not to punish him, not to report him, but to sit with him and say, "This happened, you cannot make it unhappen, these families deserve to know the truth," would he have been capable of that honesty? We cannot know. But the question is worth asking because it points toward the road not taken, the road of genuine accountability that might have interrupted the pattern. If, when he was 13 years old and already drinking, someone in that household had understood that a 13-year-old who drinks is a 13-year-old who's in pain and had responded to the pain rather than managing its surface expression, what might have grown in the space that intervention created? These questions have no answers. They never do. But they have a purpose. They force us to see Vasily Stalin as what he actually was, beneath the rank and the scandals and the falsified record and the covered-up disasters. He was a child who was never allowed to simply be a child, a young man who was never allowed to fail honestly and recover honestly, a person who was surrounded from his earliest memories to his final days by a system that treated him as a symbol, a tool, a political variable, and never, not once, as a human being whose inner life mattered. Svetlana's 3 words. His sister Svetlana said, His life was tragic. She said this from a distance, from the West, from the life she had built after her own defection, from the vantage point of someone who had also grown up inside the Stalin household, and had found, through her own complicated journey, a way to exist outside it. She knew what she was talking about. She had watched the same childhood from a different position. She had been the one their father turned toward, the one who received the complicated, suffocating love that Stalin was capable of in his warped and damaging way. She had spent her own life working through what that meant, what it had cost her, how a person builds something genuine from materials as compromised as theirs. And of her brother who had not found that way, who had been pointed in the wrong direction from the beginning and had never had the specific combination of opportunity, support, and luck that might have redirected him. She said simply, his life was tragic, not he was a bad man, not he deserved what he got, not he was a victim and bore no responsibility. Tragic. A word that contains in its classical meaning both the fall and the flaws that enabled it. A word that acknowledges agency without dismissing structure. A word that holds simultaneously the reality of what a person did and the reality of what was done to them. The apartment in Kazan returned one last time to where we began, a one-room apartment. 1962. A man who was 40 years old and looked older, who had been stripped of his name and his rank and his father and his illusions, who had married a kind nurse 3 months before and who died 2 days before his birthday, in a city that had no particular reason to remember him. The neighbors who found him did not know who he was. Why would they? He was registered as Jugashvili. He was a retired military officer with a modest pension and a complicated past that he was not permitted to discuss. He was, in the administrative vocabulary of the Soviet state, nobody. But he was somebody. He was the boy who had lost his mother at 11 and watched his father choose his sister without ever understanding why. He was the teenager who had started drinking at 13 because no one had ever taught him another way to carry what he was carrying. He was the young pilot who had flown 29 real combat missions surrounded by a manufactured reputation that made everything he actually did invisible. He was the general who had covered up a plane crash because he was terrified of his father and who had ordered an unsafe parade for the same reason. Not malice, but the deep structural fear of a man who had never, not once in his life, been allowed to simply be inadequate and survive it. He was the prisoner who had sat in Vladimir under a false name and written letters to people who did not reply. He was the exile who had come back from prison to a world that had rearranged itself entirely around his absence. He was Vasily, just Vasily, and the Soviet system. The system that had made him and used him and broken him and discarded him, rolled on without him, as it rolled on without everyone, as it would roll on until it too, eventually, reached its own end in a different city in a different year, and collapsed with the particular finality of things that were always, on some level, built on foundations that could not hold. The last word. Vasily Stalin's remains were eventually exhumed from Kazan and reburied in Troyekurovskoye Cemetery in Moscow in 2002, 40 years after his death at the request of his family. It was a small ceremony. There were no state honors. There was no military salute, but he was brought home. And perhaps that is the closest thing to resolution that a story like this can offer. Not justice. Justice would have required a different system entirely, a different childhood, a different set of choices made by dozens of different people across 4 decades. Not vindication. Too much was real. Too many people were hurt. Too many wrongs were committed in ways that genuine accountability would have to reckon with. Just the simple, belated act of bringing someone home. A man who had spent his life trying to earn a name that was never truly his, who had been built into something by forces larger than himself and had failed in the ways that such building always produces failure, and had been punished for those failures by the system that had created them, who had died alone in a one-room apartment in a city of exile 2 days before his 41st birthday with a modest woman who had been kind to him in a past too complicated for a single life to contain. His sister said his life was tragic. She was right. And the tragedy was not only his, the tragedy belongs to every system that manufactures people instead of raising them, that treats human beings as instruments of power rather than ends in themselves, that builds men on false foundations and then acts surprised when the structure falls. Vasily Stalin was one man, but the machinery that produced him was very, very large, and it is still in various forms, in various places, in various uniforms,